All right, so we are recording. Welcome, everyone. My name is Liz Degnan. I'm a librarian at the Middletown Township Public Library, and we are very excited to have Bill come. And Bill Bodei, am I pronouncing that correctly, Bill? He is the president of Deep Cut Orchid Society, and he's also an active volunteer for the American Orchid Society, serving on the Board of Trustees for the past 6 years. He's the chair of the American Orchid Society Membership and Marketing. You're busy. Bill has received the American Orchid Society President's Award in 2020 and has helped the society manage through the pandemic with a number of programs and initiatives. Bill's wife, Deb, also volunteers for the American Orchid Society and is an active judge in the American Orchid Society Northeast Judging Center. And so with no further ado, I'm going to pass the stage over to you, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share my passion for orchids with my neighbors. So not everyone is on camera, and that's fine, but I want you to just virtually raise your hand if you've ever owned an orchid and killed an orchid before. Okay. All right. So here's the good news. You're not alone. And what we say
I'm too scared to try.
In the hobby, we say you're not really an expert level orchid grower until you've killed at least 100. So for better or worse, I'm certainly in the expert category in that regard. So what I'm going to share with you tonight is just a basic presentation about orchids, how they're really easier to grow than people might realize. You don't need a greenhouse to grow them. That's kind of the theme. So I'm in a few different orchid clubs, one local, one national, and less than 10% of the members of our orchid clubs have greenhouses. Some of them have gone into, growing under lights in the basement and things like that, and have developed very elaborate ways to grow orchids successfully indoors. It is an addictive hobby, so there's caution. It's a cautionary tale. But also, you don't need to have hundreds of orchids to enjoy them. You can just have one or two. The trick that we want to get past is this concept that they're difficult to take care of. So the topics I've prepared for you tonight, why, from a hobbyist perspective, someone who started with one single orchid and now has more orchids than he would readily admit, but it's more than 1,000. Why? How does that happen? Why do we do this? Why do orchid hobbyists do what we do? And then extend that to kind of the casual grower. We'll talk a lot about orchid care. In the hobby, we call it culture. It's really synonymous with how do you take care of your orchid, but there's some environmental aspects to it. Touch on buying orchids, some tips, and then from 1 to 1,000, mine and my wife's kind of personal journey, how orchids affected us personally, for better or worse, and how, if you're not careful, it might also grab you. So why do we do this in the first place? I think I credit the diversity of the plant family. So Orchidaceae, the plant family, have about 28,000 accepted species. So that's second only to the daisy family or the aster family. But when you consider that in addition to the accepted species, breeding has contributed more than 170,000 additional hybrids and cultivars. So you look at some of the bullets on here relative to some of the other things, like if you're a birder or you're a, it's really remarkable, the diversity, and that's what draws a lot of people to the orchid hobby, is your love of learning. And there's something, you literally think about, I can learn something new every day. You can learn 10 new things every day about orchids if you really get into that hobby and you like to learn. So orchids can be fragrant. That's another reason we collect them. And many of those are really, really pleasant. We have orchids that are fragrant at dusk. And so it's fragrant when the pollinator that pollinates that plant is active. So the plants that are at dusk will will attract moths. And so it's similar to maybe if you've ever heard of the angel trumpet plant. It's a very citrusy smell that attracts moths. It's very pungent, but it's also really, really nice. There are orchids that smell in the morning. There are orchids that smell in the middle of the day. And as you may have saw on the previous slide, the vanilla plant is an actual orchid seed pod that is also fragrant like vanilla. But the other interesting thing about orchids, you learn a lot about how they're pollinated, and the adaptations is a big part of the orchid story. And so some of the pollinators represent the scent that that particular orchid might be putting out to attract its pollinators. So the consequence of this is that some orchids are not particularly fragrant in a good way. So we have orchids that are pollinated by flies. Many of the bulbophyllum species are pollinated by flies. And some of the flowers smell like rotting flesh, or, like that funny plant that they show blooming in the NYBG once a year, the death plant or something like that. So anyway, not all fragrant means good fragrance. But really, the number one reason why we grow orchids, why we collect orchids, it's the flowers. And so a couple things about those flowers. A lot of the orchids will bloom when nothing else is in bloom. I mean, we call orchid show season, where a lot of orchid shows take place, like January through April. And so when you think about your own garden or your own, living room or wherever, not a lot of things are blooming in that time. Some of the orchid blooms will last for months, where you compare that to, flowering shrubs outside, like, all of the spring flowering plants, your azaleas, your rhododendrons, your bulbs. They all have a period of maybe 2 weeks, right? And some of the orchid blooms can last. Some orchids are in bloom almost continuously. Most important point, they will rebloom if you know how to take care of them. And a lot of what we're going to share tonight with you is really focused on being conscious of what a plant needs to reward you. But if we're really being honest, right, the hobbyists like myself, we collect orchids because we like to show them to people. And so we grow them to show them. We have orchid shows, like, where 7 or 10 different orchid clubs will come together with 10 or 15 orchid vendors, and they'll put 15 to 20 orchid displays up for the public to come in and see. It's a really tremendous thing to see. And if you've ever been to the Philadelphia Flower Show, it's like that, but just for orchids. If you've ever been to the Dearborn Market in February, Deep Cut Orchid Society puts its annual show on in the greenhouse in February. And so it's a really amazing experience to walk into a greenhouse in an orchid show in the middle of winter, where it's dreary and gray. And you see all these, this plant here is a plant of mine. That flower is about 3-4 inches across. That plant had this year 75 flowers on it across like 6 flower spikes. Imagine, a greenhouse full of, hundreds of plants doing things like this, right? So it's really, it's therapeutic, right? We live hectic lives, and to be around, flowers is a very calming thing. I've come to appreciate with the anxiety and stress that life can throw at us. It's a great grounding hobby, just taking care of orchids. So what I want to share with you is just a few different genera of orchid that, again, in the spirit of why we do this, right? So most of the pictures I've grabbed off the American Orchid Society's awards database, which there's a whole judging program. People grow orchids to be judged like dogs and roses. There's a judging program for a lot of things, and orchids is no different. It's a fairly sophisticated program. But Phalaenopsis is the most common orchid you're used to seeing in the supermarkets and the big box stores. They have come a long way and made a lot of advancements in mass production and in Asia, especially Taiwan. And so they've really brought the price down We call Phalaenopsis the gateway drug a lot of times because it's a lot of how people originally get into orchids, but a lot of people don't get them to rebloom. What you don't know about the Phalaenopsis is there's a lot more variety just to this genera than the ones that you see in the big box stores. So this one on the left, you might see at Whole Foods, but there's a whole nother range of types of Phalaenopsis even that are want different heat and light conditions, are fragrant, which the supermarket varieties typically aren't. So this one down here on the bottom, Phalaenopsis billina James Curtis Crow, FCCAOS, smells amazing, like the nicest fragrance you could get at Macy's in the body care, makeup and cream section of the store, because it's all of these are incredibly fragrant, except for maybe this one on the left. Angraecum is another interesting orchid. If you've ever heard the story of Darwin's orchid, the Angraecum sesquipedale on the left is part of that. What Darwin observed when he was studying evolution was that this particular orchid, there must exist a pollinator with a 14-inch proboscis, I call it a tongue because I can usually not pronounce the P word that I'm not even going to try and pronounce again, because usually I screw that up. But basically, after Darwin died, they did film in the jungle a moth that unrolled this 14-inch tongue that shot down this spur to get to the nectar at the bottom of the spur. And so it was one of the missing links of Darwin's theory of evolution. That's why they call this Darwin's orchid. He didn't live to see the discovery of the actual pollinator, but he knew it must have existed and adapted to deal with that particular arrangement of where the nectar is to pollinate the plant. Bulbophyllum is one of those plants that it doesn't have the nicest fragrance, as I mentioned earlier. So you see a couple of examples here. They have a lot of variety. Bulbophyllum as a genera is the most diverse within the orchid family. So that's saying something. So there's a really wide variety. They're a little tricky to grow. They're more for the collector. They like certain conditions that are more difficult to replicate, but they love the warmth and humidity of Florida. So if anybody's thinking about moving to Florida, you could probably grow bulbophyllums pretty successfully down there. Cattleya is probably one of my favorite. It's the old corsage orchid. So in the 20s and 30s, women of wealth and stature would have fresh cut flowers. There was an entire fresh cut flower industry in New Jersey that supported both New York and Philadelphia's high society. And women would wear fancy cattleyas on their dresses and their hats and their hair. They don't do that anymore. So the cattleya is more evolved to a collector's item, but they are big and they are showy and they are mostly fragrant and they're extremely diverse as well in their variety. I have hundreds of cattleyas, and if you choose certain plants, they can bloom for you all year long. In fact, in June, it's the Brazilian cattleyas, purpurata, that is in bloom in great abundance right now. And if anybody's interested, and I'll cover this at the end as well, we actually have on Tuesday at our monthly Deep Cut Orchid Society meeting at the Monmouth Reform Temple in Tinton Falls, a purpurata grower from Brazil. He actually lives in Florida. Really good talk. He'll have plants for sale that are easy to grow in the house. It's going to be a good meeting, and visitors are always welcome. So a little plug for the Deep Cut Orchid Society. I'll cover that again at the end. So just a close up of kind of these plants have big flowers too, not quite the size of your fist, but almost, right? Some of these standard cattleyas and the show that cattleyas can put on with not just the visual, but the fragrance is really over the top. Dendrobium is another flower that can be fragrant. It's a lot of diversity. Dendrobiums do well with a little more neglect. So if you're not a person who feels confident that you can tend to your orchids every whim, Dendrobium is not a bad orchid to look at. They tend to do well with being ignored a little more than other plants do. Dracula is also known as the monkey orchid. Here's a couple of images that you might understand why they call this the monkey orchid. You can see in the middle, there's a little face that looks like a monkey, two eyes. There's hundreds of different Dracula, and they all have little monkey faces, and it's really unbelievable. These are tricky to grow as well, but if you give them the right conditions, they can be really rewarding as well. Natural area is known as the coconut orchid. Why? Because it smells like coconuts. So it's interesting. You start to see the fragrances develop for different kinds of plants. And this is the kind of plant that every orchid hobbyist will have in their collection at one point or another. It's really easy to grow, flowers pretty reliably, also does okay with neglect. And the flowers are fragrant, and the flowers are really interesting. They're not very big. So a flower like that might be a little bit bigger than a $50 silver dollar, but they're really rewarding and they smell really nice. The jewel orchid is a plant that's known as much for its really nice foliage as it is its flowers. So that's a pretty big example of a Ludicea discolor that's flowering, but the leaves themselves are really, really nice. And this is the kind of plant that will be okay indoors with indoor light, like any kind of African violet or some other houseplants. Yeah. Slipper orchids are another kind of orchid that's got a lot of diversity. The one on the left is Paphiopedilum micranthum. I like this style of slipper because it's got what I call the big chin. But all of the slipper orchids have this pouch in common. So you see it here in the middle, and then you see a variety here on the right. And what this is this is a bait and switch trap for the pollinator to fly into this pouch. And once they get into the pouch, the only way they can get back out is through this tiny little hole up towards the center of the plant. And you can see that in different areas. And what happens when the insect crawls out, it gets pollen stuck to its back. And it goes to the next plant. And it leaves the pollen, and it just got stuck on the other plant. And so that's how it pollinates the plants. And so this plant in the middle has what look like aphids on the leaves to attract pollinators that might be interested in eating an aphid. And then the pollinator gets curious and goes down into the pouch. And so all these lady slippers have this characteristic. Those were Paphiopedilums. These are Phragmipediums. These are a little showier, but same idea. They have a pouch. They're a little bit trickier to take care of, but they're equally rewarding. So okay, I'm just checking the chat periodically. If there's any questions, Liz, I know you're gonna let me know, right? Okay, yeah. So if you guys have questions or comments, certainly feel free to ask while I'm speaking. I can go for a while, so I'll be happy to answer your questions. So Oncidium is another orchid that I would consider really easy to grow. It's probably second only to Phalaenopsis in its success rate with hobbyist growers in the living room kind of plant. Doesn't need a lot of light, pretty reliable. Flower. Just a couple of things you need to remember with these plants. Shari Baby is a plant that's pretty well known because it smells like chocolate. So it's also called the chocolate orchid. So last plant, Maxillaria, we had the coconut orchid. Now we have the chocolate orchid. So we're starting to assemble, sounds almost like an ice cream bar, but I'm happy to share these plants with you. Vanda is one of my favorites as well. This is tricky to grow up here unless you have a greenhouse. And the reason for that, although I shouldn't say that anymore, people do grow them successfully in the house under lights. They want a lot of light. They also usually grow in areas where there's a lot of rain and it's high humidity. So every morning it rains in the subtropics and in Malaysia and Thailand and Singapore and Miami, and they love it in those kinds of environments. So can you recreate that kind of environment in New Jersey? Yes, you can, but it's a little bit more work, right? There's also an offshoot of Vanda. It never used to be categorized as Vanda, but it's a separate kind of orchid into itself called Neophonetia. It's a species that's now under the Vanda taxonomy. And this is a prized orchid, especially in Japan. It's grown as much for its foliage, and people buy decorative pots to display them in. They grow on the windowsill just great. They're small. Small as in like that whole plant may not be more than, even though it looks really big, less than 8 inches across. So it's a pretty compact plant. And they also are very fragrant, and they also bloom in the June and July timeframe. Then there's this whole idea of a miniature orchid where either through species or through selective breeding, breeders have delivered us flowers and plants that are really compact and small. Some of the minis that are species are so small, judges need a magnifying glass to look at the flowers. So just kind of an example of some of the scale of the flowers. When you look at it really close, it's a really intricate and amazing looking flower. But again, it doesn't take up a lot of room. So on the bottom left, you see a miniature version of a Phragmipedium with the big pouch. But they get even smaller than that. So here's an example of a really, really teeny tiny one. Some of our club members absolutely love these plants because they can collect dozens of them. And so, they don't mind that the flowers are small. There's another example just for scale. You can grow a lot of these on mounts and just have a little mist them each day. Cymbidium, another favorite of mine. You're starting to see a pattern here. All of them are my favorite. Cymbidium's known for its big showy flowers. It's a picture of the Cymbidium do freckle face that I showed you earlier. This is a cousin or a relative of that on the left. It's called Corinthian Splash. This was a plant that my wife and I got an award at the North Jersey Orchid Show this past January, where I think the plant at the time had, I'm going to say 350 flowers on it across 16 or 17 flower spikes. It was probably 3 feet across. So yeah, these get a little big, which is why you sometimes will find yourself putting up little pop-up greenhouses or, adding a sunroom to your house or things like that, because they are really nice. And then on the right, you see an example of a yellow color form. So they also have a lot of different variety. This was my living room a few years ago. We actually had that casement window in the background put in along with the skylights, which you see above. And that's a southwest facing corner. So not quite a sunroom, but this was the first erratic behavior that we displayed as orchid hobbyists. We started doing construction in our house to suit the needs of the plants. But they're very rewarding, and we have orchids in flower in our house, all year long. It's just kind of an example of some of the ones up close. So that one on the bottom left had probably a couple hundred flowers on it. There's an up close of the yellow one that was an awarded flower we got in February at the Deep Cut Show. And then there's my favorite again, freckle face. The easiest orchids to bloom are the Phalaenopsis for most people. Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums. And if you're not sure, like you haven't seen these, Dearborn Market is close. They actually carry a pretty good selection of orchids. And so not the worst place to go. They get them from reputable growers. So it's not like you're getting it's a step above the big box store variety. And there's some reasons why you would want to consider buying from a Dearborn as opposed to a Home Depot. And then Home Depot might be fine for some people. And the lady slippers in particular, there's a certain kind of lady slipper called the Bodei type, which really doesn't need much light at all. But they are also low light type plants. Some of the plants require a little bit more temperature change than you could deliver in your living room day night. So these are the kinds of things we start to think about with a particular plant's requirements for it to be happy. So we get into kind of growing orchids and understanding what that's all about, right? Are they hard to grow? No, but they do have some unique requirements. And starting with the fact that you want to understand they grow on trees in the wild, most of them. On trees means epiphytic, means not a parasite, just using it for support, much like you might see ivy climb a tree. Orchids live on trees. When we're putting an orchid in a pot with bark, it's just to hold it in place. It's not, we're still trying to mimic the kind of conditions an orchid would see out in the wild on a tree, which means, it's used to air that's being very humid. The roots dry out very regularly. So some of these orchids are more forgiving, but the greenhouse is not required for many of these. You just need to do your best to try and provide an environment that mimics what it wants. And so I always say a good orchid grower only needs to know two things. What does the plant that you have want, right? What kind of conditions does this plant want to live, or need to live, but want to thrive? And then the second question is, if you understand that, number one, can you give it what it wants, right? And so, I think about, people that are trying to recreate really difficult conditions that are not native to their house. A lot of plants that are orchids, they care more about, air movement and humidity. They of course want light and temperature and moisture. That's most plants. But there's a few more variables that orchids care about. So we'll get into these in a little bit more detail, but light, temperature, moisture, humidity, and air movement are 5 things to think about. How you water, when you water, how and when you repot that plant, right? So this is in its entirety what we would describe as culture. What's your culture? What kind of culture can you deliver? Are you an overwaterer or an underwaterer? Right? Will it be a stretch for you to water once a week? Do you water every day? Right? Is that your personality? You can adjust your conditions to suit that in some cases, even if you're one or the other. But that's the things that you have to think about is your ability to deliver the conditions that the plant wants. It's in gardening, we used to call this, put the right plant in the right spot. Had we known that, my wife and I wouldn't have put the rhododendron that we got as a gift, as a housewarming gift, in its pot from the nursery on our front stoop with the south-facing window and not water it all that much. And it was in the full sun. And so, yeah, it lasted maybe a month and a half before it died. We didn't even know at the time that it was supposed to go in the ground. But that was years ago. And so now we want to understand what this plant wants, and we want to understand, can we give that plant what it wants? One other thing to think about when you're looking at becoming an orchid hobbyist or just looking at buying an orchid is hybrids in general are easier to care for. And we'll get into why in a minute, but when you think about what happens on the right with this Maltipoo, it's a poodle that's been bred down because they like the attributes of the poodle, the hair, the temperament, but they wanted the smaller version of the poodle. Orchid hobbyists that become hybridizers are doing the same thing with orchid plants. So much like you have the Maltipoo from the poodle, then all of a sudden you've got, a lot of variations in dog breeding and a lot of variations in orchid breeding as well. And this goes on, but it speaks to kind of more of the variety. What is a breeder trying to achieve by crossing this plant that's got a bright red color with this plant that's really small? Well, maybe he wants a smaller version of the red plant, right? And that's been a lot of the trend, is to breed down in size for, people that don't have a lot of space. And so that's a lot of us, right? We don't have a lot of space. So, you can only fit so many plants in your house, right? Before you start, putting skylights in your living room and buying greenhouses. In general, species are harder to grow than hybrids only because they're less forgiving. And so hybrids have a better tolerance because they may take the cultural requirements of one plant than another. This one likes it cold, this one likes it warm. This now has a wider temperature tolerance. But if you think about like a species of orchid that's native to an Ecuadorian cloud forest, what kind of cultural conditions would that be? It's on the equator, so it's going to be really, really bright and really, really long days all the time. The shortest days are 12 hours. It's as bright as you can be in terms of the sun intensity, but it's also in a cloud forest, so it's 3,000 feet above sea level, covered in clouds. So it's cold really, really bright, but diffused through the clouds, and also highly humid because of the mist from the clouds. So think about trying to recreate those conditions. When you start to combine really bright and cool together, that's the beginning of your challenges, right? And then you start to add all of these other things. There are people that grow plants native to Ecuadorian cloud forests in our club in little converted fish tanks, or fish tanks that are actually purpose-built to grow orchids in them, where people do all kinds of crazy things. So again, your appetite to try and create something that's a challenge is one of the reasons why people enjoy taking up the orchid hobby. Just a word on temp, when we say cool, there's different considerations there. Like some plants care about the nighttime temp, not to go below X. Some cool growers can't go above Y, right? So some of those Draculas, they're more on the, I can't be above 80 degrees for very long, or I'm going to be really unhappy. Intermediates, kind of a lot of the common orchids, around 60 degrees at night. Warm orchids no less than 65 usually at night. So again, considerations at some of the Vanda species, which is another trick and why you often find yourself having a greenhouse for Vandas to keep the temperature up above 65. So temperature in general, orchids are going to be comfy where you're comfy for the most part. And if you think about the typical home temperature, the biggest trick of home growing is if this particular plant type wants a larger day-night differential that is normal to what your house would be. You can get around that sometimes by putting something very close to a casement window or a bay window, and maybe even crack the window because it's generally a little bit colder right next to the window. So you can create little microclimates in your house. There's also little warm islands as well. And some people like to grow their plants in the bathroom because the humidity is higher and they have a skylight in there, things like that. So when you think about light, it's easy enough to get a light meter. They're cheap. This is changing depending on whether you're thinking about measuring light outside or natural light versus artificial light. More and more you're seeing LEDs become prominent. So there's a whole different class of light meter to test a different trait than we used to measure, which was foot candles. That's less relevant for LEDs. And so there's something called a par meter. In the bottom right, you can see these are two light meters that I bought. Both of them were under, $30 or $40, not too bad. But highlight in Florida is not the same as highlight in New Jersey. And if we were thinking about foot candles, highlight in full sun in Florida is closer to 12 to 15,000 foot candles, where in New Jersey it might be 10 to 12. And a plant like a Vanda might only want 8 to 10. So a lot of this comes back to understanding if you're going to give the plant too much light, you might burn it. But in general, the more light you give it, the better flowering you're going to get. And it's really the number one reason why orchids don't rebloom is not enough light. It's the number one reason. You can tell by looking at the plant leaves, if they're really, 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 really dark green, it's going to look nice and lush, but that's an indication that it's trying to get more sun. Some of the wider leafed plants are used to adapting to lower light conditions. But in general, an orchid that's grown with good light should be more of a light, almost olive green, as opposed to a dark, lush green. As much light as they can take without burning is something that a lot of the nurseries will say for a lot of different, high valued flowers like Cattleya and Vanda. Less so for Phalaenopsis because they will burn. But light is the key. Light is the key for good flowering. Watering is important, but it's less important than light. The fact is more people kill orchids by killing them with kindness than any other reason. They're overwatering, but they may also not be watering correctly. And so that's another thing to think about, right? An orchid can't be killed by overwatering one time. You could put an orchid in a pail of water submerged for 24 hours. Take it out, it'll be just fine. The roots are adapted to not know when its next watering is coming. And so really when you're thinking about watering orchids, you really want to understand what's going on with the roots. And so you could see a couple of examples of what people believe are the orchid roots up on the right here. You can see this little brown tip trailing down, and then you can see these on the left trailing down that white, thick, probably as thick as, an extension cord, maybe a little bit less, thin one. But that's actually not the root of the plant. That's an adaptation. That's a covering for the root, and it's called velamen. And why is that important? And it's important to understand the structure of the roots to know why and how you should be watering orchids. Especially when they're new, they're a little bit tougher, much like a brand new sponge that you try and make wet. And if you just run water on the sponge in the sink, it's going to run right off. And the same, like if you're ever trying to get peat moss saturated before you use it in potting. It takes a little while for the water to get taken in. And then once it gets taken in, it holds on to it for a while, like a sponge, like peat moss. This is an adaptation. So what you want to do with an orchid is you want to water it really, really thoroughly. A lot of people will say, okay, and again, I'm going to come back to the kind of media that it has, which will determine how wet it stays and for how long. But in general, if you're growing a plant in bark, you take it over the sink and water it really thoroughly for 30 seconds. What I would do is walk away and 10 minutes later, come back and do that again. That's more aligned with what the plant will see in nature. So a little bit of the time, or a lot of the time, but just give it a chance to kind of soak the water in like you're trying to water a dry sponge, and you'll have a lot more success. So there's really thin hair-like, it's like a really thick hair or a broom bristle that shoots down the middle of this velamen, that the more that the velamen can store water for a long time, the better off the plant will be in between waterings. If you think about an orchid more like a cactus, it doesn't need to be wet all the time because that will eventually rot the roots. In fact, it wants to dry out. Orchid roots need to breathe. So you don't want to pack them in with something really thick without a lot of air movement inside the pot. So potting mix, when you're trying to determine whether or not the orchid is in need of water again, this is assuming this is in bark, but also even if it's in moss, you're going to notice a big difference between a pot that's well watered and one that's dry. And think about a big mug of coffee and how much different it feels when it's full of coffee and when it's empty. And you'll start to pay attention to the weight of the pot. And also you can see the clay pots will feel dry. There's better evaporation through clay. That's why a lot of orchid hobbyists will grow in clay. But in general, the best advice is to feel the weight of the pot. And if the pot is getting lighter, and the day before it's really, 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 really light, is the day usually you want to water it, and water it really, really well. The other thing is to have good drainage in the pot. And you want to make sure that water can run freely through the bottom. You don't want to leave an orchid and water it in a pot that doesn't drain. And that includes clay, decorative pots that you might get when you buy the orchid from the supermarket. You want to take it out of that pot and water it in the sink and make sure it's almost dry before you water it again. So on the left is a good example of, great way to have an orchid if you're trying to grow it really well. It's sitting on a homemade humidity tray with clay pebbles. And, you can actually water it right in place and the water will drain into the clay. It's not sitting in the water, but it's creating a little microclimate underneath of humidity, right in that area. It's going to get more humid there than the rest of the house as the water evaporates. On the right is a plant that you might get as a gift for, a holiday or Mother's Day or something like that. And so this is not what you want to keep the plant in to grow it. You can certainly display it in that. Or you can keep it in there, but don't water it in there. Take it out. There's usually a plastic pot this is in that's inside the clay. So the clay pot's fine for display, but it's not you cannot and should never allow water to collect inside of there and have the plant sit in water. That's not something. There are some varieties of orchids that like to sit in water, but the ones in the supermarket are not that kind. So you don't want that. Fertilizer, again, in the degree of importance, they do want to be fed, but if you think about a plant stuck to a tree, the nutrients that it would get in nature is very, very low. It's a little bit of organic material that's breaking down over time, like a leaf that's fallen off the tree that is now breaking down in the crook of where the plant is attached to the tree, because rainwater is generally pretty pure. So when you're fertilizing orchids, maybe you've heard this in other hobbies as well, but weekly is good, but weekly, like not a high concentration. So whatever fertilizer you get, generally you want to cut the proportion really way down. And urea is an ingredient in a lot of fertilizers that is the nitrogen source. If you can find a fertilizer that doesn't have urea, it's taken up a little bit better by the plant. It's not a killer, but again, urea-free is better. So another aspect of culture is repotting, knowing when to do something with the orchid that you have so that it continues to be happy. And again, a lot of this comes back to, is the orchid mounted? Is it in bark? Is it in moss? Is it in something else? Because as the moss or the bark breaks down, eventually that can rot your roots, which will eventually kill the plant, which is why, a plant could be fine for 5 years and one day it just dies all of a sudden. Most orchids do need to be repotted at some point or another, understanding what your plant wants as it relates to timing and frequency becomes what's important to know. So don't be afraid of repotting an orchid. It's not crazy complicated. And in our club, we show newbies all the time how to do it, and they bring their plants sometimes to our meetings, and we help them. We even have little workshops and stuff where people bring their plants and we all repot together. But it's something that if you want to grow orchids, you're going to have to do eventually, or you can take it back to some of the nurseries that sell orchids will do repotting for you as well. So timing matters for some more than others. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. The slipper orchids are less sensitive. They can be repotted more or less whenever. Cattleya is usually the corsage orchids. Usually, if you can get them right before the new growth starts, it's good. If not, you gotta be a little more careful, not disrupting the roots. Cymbidiums, the showy ones, before they start growing, really before. Dendrobium a little bit after. They're a little more sensitive as well to being disrupted because a lot of the plants like to become pot bound, and they actually like it that way. Cymbidiums and Dendrobiums especially. So disrupting that sets the plant back. So another consideration, what kind of media you choose to use. But for me, I like to think of myself as a fancy French chef and having everything in its special place. Now, mind you, I'm repotting dozens of orchids at a time, sometimes 50 in a day, sometimes 100. So it's a little bit more important for me to have an environment that I can do this at scale. But still, it's important to think about what the kinds of things are that you might need if you're going to go about repotting your orchids. Make a checklist of what you'll want to have on hand before you start, and then remember about the timing. Here's just a checklist that I use. Different types of pots and sizes, right? What kind of media do I want to have? Clips to hold the plant in case it's a little loose in the pot. You don't want that. Good sharp pruner or razor blades, a torch to torch off the pruner in between cuttings so that you don't transmit disease. Stakes to hold the plant in place. Pencils, gloves, paper, a camera to take a picture of the plant. It's good for record keeping. If you have a lot of plants, you want to keep track of them. And then I usually will top dress with a slow release fertilizer when I'm done. We use labels in orchid hobbyists, use labels because we want to know what the plant is. We can't get an award on it. We can show it, but in general, we don't necessarily know what kind of conditions it would need or the extension or the history. And for orchid judging in particular, this is important. Not to everybody. Some people don't care about labels, but a lot of the hobbyists really do. Also a good place to keep track of when you last repotted it, where you got it. So I can tell on the right of this label here, July 22 was the last time I repotted this particular plant. I also put a unique identifier on my labels that I also write on the pot. Why? Because labels always get lost. And so my wife thinks I'm the culprit of losing the labels. I blame it on the squirrels. But no matter what, the labels separate from the pots. especially if you put the plants outside, which a lot of people like to do in the summertime because they like being outside. We also use color coding in our collection to understand which ones we might want to donate one day, or what's the one that cost me a lot of money. I better really pay attention to that one especially. And then some other, easy to identify, categories. So people that get a new orchid for the first time see this and they panic and say, my orchid's dying. It's actually natural for the stem to die back once the flowering is done, right? So Phalaenopsis tend to shoot up a flower spike right before monsoon season in its native habitat. And so it's trying to reproduce before it might get wiped out. But then it's going to die back after the flowers fall off. So what should you do about that? Should you cut the spike off? When should you cut it off? The answer is yes, you should cut it off. You don't have to. You can let it die back naturally. But some people will cut it off a little early to see if they can get more flowers to come out of that particular branch. If they don't have a lot of confidence that they're going to get it to reflower next year, people might do this. So if you cut in between the nodes, which you can see an example of where a leaf might pop out, it's a little break in the stem with the inflorescence. You can cut in between there and you might get it to flower again. Now, mind you, the plant's going to put more energy into the flowering and less energy into trying to push down new roots and get ready for next year. So there's a trade-off with doing something like this, but it's also a way to get an orchid to reflower on the same stem in the same blooming cycle. It may also branch and have multiple stems come out of that one stem. So certainly something to try. When you're thinking about orchid culture, you want to think about the timeliness. How quickly do you need the information? So you're trying to figure out, what this plant needs, because I'm not sure. I got it from a friend, or I don't remember where I got it, or I don't even know what it is. Trying to find out. The faster you get it usually means it's a little bit more work to find the authoritative information. You might have to do a little bit more research on your own, but you can crowdsource a lot of this. What I mean by crowdsource: Facebook, other social media channels, Instagram. Take a picture of the flower. Anybody know what this is? We see a lot of that in the American Orchid Society. So American Orchid Society, as Liz mentioned, I volunteer for. And so we had taken over their Facebook group about 5-6 years ago. We've grown it up from about 20,000 people, maybe not even, to over almost 200,000 people in our American Orchid Society Facebook group. We get about 1,000 new members every single week. It's amazing because every single month we have about 5,000 posts of people either showing off their flowers or posting questions about their plants. Hey, does anybody know what this spot means? Or can anybody tell me what this flower is? Or does anybody know where I can get this? And so it's a really vibrant, active community. You can see on the right here an example of someone who put a question in, hey, what is this? Sunburn, or is it a fungus problem? Right? And you could see sunburn would just be a black spot, but on that right leaf, you could see a yellow ring around the black spot, and that's going to get bigger. That's an indication that it's fungal, not sunburn. Plants can sunburn just like people do. And the problem with a sunburnt leaf is it doesn't come back. So the problem with, orchid advice is, sometimes it's not always really accurate, right? So you might get 50 people commenting in Facebook and 10 of them come up with this off the wall stuff. So you've got to, just put it in context. Like usually a majority of people will get to the right answer if you're asking a question, but you wouldn't go for medical advice on Facebook, right? Well, I mean, some people do, but you probably shouldn't. So not everything on Facebook is reliable. St. Augustine Orchid Society is another great resource for beginners. St. Aug Orchid Society.org. This is one of my go-tos. I go to it all the time. It's got a lot of images, helps me identify problems with my orchids. It's got wonderful articles on fertilizer, on pesticide, on fungicide, everything you could ever imagine. It's organized really, really well. In terms of shopping, so a couple of tips. What we try and say in the hobby is that we try and support the reputable orchid growers over the big box stores, right? It's almost like the equivalent of shop local, right? They're more inclined to tell you about the plant. They want you to be successful. We're not a big fan of, orchids in flower and plastic in the big box stores in a ceramic pot, because they're typically mass produced in a foreign country and they typically don't come with labels. So that's not doing a lot to advance conservation of orchids or anything like that. So we generally frown on those kinds of plants, but we're not super snobby about it. And, if you've ever seen Just Add Ice orchids, there they say you can just put a couple of ice cubes on the orchid once a week. While it's true that orchid may not die if you do that, it's not necessarily optimal for the orchid to thrive. That's the most polite way I can say it. And some orchids will have a lot of problems if you do that. But basically, we like to say ice is for cocktails in the orchid hobby. So how do is it a reputable grower? Well, do they hybridize, or are they just a broker or a reseller, right? Oh, do you make your own orchids? Do you make your own hybrids? It's a good question to ask. Oh, how many of those do you have? Maybe they have one, maybe that's all they sell, right? They're not likely to sell you something you can't grow. A reputable orchid grower is not going to sell you, if you live in Florida, an orchid that is, really not wanting to be above 80 degrees. They're knowledgeable. The plants are expertly grown. They'll typically provide really good advice. My first orchid, I just listened to what my vendor told me, and we rebloomed the next year. And then some of the purchases might actually support conservation of species in cultivation. As deforestation happens, sometimes plants are no longer native to their habitats because their habitats are gone, but the species still exist because people grow them as hobbyists. So finishing up, how did I get here? Right, it all started like a lot of us on a windowsill. I mentioned earlier, we started to enhance our living room with skylights and a casement window, and then extended with a table the windowsill of the bay window to be bigger. And so we were into it. And, our very first orchid we had success with, right? So this is not a common orchid for someone to buy as their very first plant. We bought Cymbidium Dame Catherine, I think it was 2009, at the Dearborn Market show, which was Deep Cut Orchid Society's show. And so we bought this orchid, we joined the Orchid Club, and it was 2009. And all we did was listen to the guy who sold it to us and follow his instructions. And then, we rebloomed it the next year, and people said, wow, that's really good. If you rebloomed a Cymbidium, that's not too easy to do. Oh, cool. So we had some luck with it. Now this plant has been divided, I think. Oh boy, I just divided it again. This plant was in the Dearborn show in February. It got a special American Orchid Society award for its culture. It had 10 flower spikes, probably 160 flowers on it. This flower is about 2.5 inches across. I just divided this into, I think, 6 plants. So I think I've gotten, I don't know. And I have another one that could be divided next year. But I actually have the vision of this that I'm going to be giving away in the fall at our Orchid Club, or maybe put in our auction in the fall. Now we've gone from windowsill to 3 greenhouses in the backyard. You could see them here in the winter. So yeah, we've got to go out there in the winter and make sure everything's okay and the heat stays on. So, it gets to be a little crazy. So you've been warned. In the summertime, it's a lot nicer. You can see kind of the layout of the yard and the first greenhouse we got, the second one, and then the third one, right? And they're all different temperatures as well. So we've integrated the greenhouses as much as we can into the garden. So this is in the spring when the irises and alliums are up. And when you open the door to the greenhouse, you can see we're also using it for storage of a lot of our tropical. So we've got banana trees that we take out, and they live outside in the summer, and all of this goes back into the greenhouse each winter, or one of the 3. This is just an example of the kinds of plants that we'll be seeing this coming Tuesday at our deep cut orchid meeting, because a lot of these are cattleyas and purpuratas in particular, and it is purpurata season. So I have probably half a dozen plants like this. Many of these plants are actually in bloom again right now. And then our last orchid is our dog named Vanda. We named her after my favorite kind of orchid. So this was Vanda in November of 2020. I got a call this was right when COVID was starting to like, is it over? Is it not over? It was right before like the whole Delta blow up. And so a friend of ours, the president at the time of the American Orchid Society, he's an orchid breeder in Florida, called me up and said, I want to give you and Deb a puppy, because he knew we had had Rottweilers in the past. I said, oh boy. So I asked, and to our great dismay, we said yes. And then I tried to fly down to Florida with a little bag to take her home. And right before I got on the plane, I decided I should call United to double check the age restriction. And I was told it was 8 weeks by a family member who works at United, who was incorrect. And it's actually 16 weeks now. And so I didn't go on the plane that day. And then 2 days later, I went on a plane and rented a car and drove home with Vanda from Florida in November of 2020. So this is her now. She's much bigger. And she also looks after our greenhouses when we're not able to. But so that's it. I'm happy to take any questions, or one more plug oh yeah, I wanted to show you one other thing. I'll leave it on this page. I'm going to share my screen again in a second. The Deep Cut Orchid Society, we would love to see you at our meeting this Tuesday. If you're around, let me share my screen again up. deepcutorchidsociety.org is our website. This is the main page of the website. And if you scroll down, you can see our events calendar here. So right here, it would say July 11th. If I click on this, it's going to expand. It's got and this works really well on a phone. So deepcutorchidsociety.org. If I click this, it's going to go into Google Maps, and I could just press go, but it also has the address here. And each meeting we have all of our members bring orchids in the show on the show table. We have a speaker each month. We have free snacks. We give away door prizes. This month, Francisco Miranda will be in from Miranda Orchids in Florida. He's going to talk about the genus Cattleya in Brazil. So if you've never been to an orchid club meeting, is it really the 13th, or do I have it? Yeah, it's the 13th. Okay, I should check the events calendar, make sure oh, that's July. Yeah, so anyway, June 13th, here it is. I was on the wrong one. Scared me for a minute. Same thing. And you can check out our website, learn more about us, what we do. This is going to be a really good meeting. Francisco's incredible speaker, and he has really, really good plant material for sale. A lot of it's really, really small and could be grown in the house on a sunny window, and it won't get too big for you. So that's my talk. I'm going to stop sharing again and see if anybody has any questions.
Hey, Bill. My name's Dara. Thanks for the presentation. Well structured and informative. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about like orchid viruses, and just for like a hobbyist at your scale. Do you find a need to have like quarantine procedures or to virus test them? And I asked this from the context of I read a hobbyist had like 400 orchids. He virus tested all of them. You know, these kits are pretty expensive, like $5 a test strip. He found about 5% viruses, and this is asking from someone that wants to like divide and share their plants with others.
Yeah, so it's a great question. When you get to a collection at scale, or any collection really, virus is a concern because you can't cure a virus. Most of the time, people will tell you to throw the plant out, right? So we all have we all try to follow, I shouldn't say all of us, but many of us try and follow protocols that reduce the likelihood of transmission of virus. And a lot of that comes from pruning and sharing cutting tools. So we become the vector to transmit virus from one plant to the other if we don't torch the tools in between. So I have an automatic propane gas-fired plumber torch, MAP gas actually, it's twice as hot as the propane. And I flame my tool every time I'm finished with it before I move on to the next plant. It is true that biting and sucking insects can be a vector of virus as well. You can tell virus sometimes by how it presents in the flower. You can start to see color break in the flower itself. St. Aug Orchid Society has a lot of great imagery that shows examples of what a virused flower might look like. Also, you could see it present sometimes in the leaves with black streaking. And yeah, it's a concern. And it's not uncommon I think everybody may have one or two plants in their collection that could be virused. Some people will quarantine new plants that they get into their greenhouse before they release them into the general population, just to see the plant flower, or moreover, to make sure that it's pest-free or other disease-free, namely fungal or bacterial. In general, a lot of bacterial and fungal can be kept down with good culture. Virus, not so much. So we do regularly test our plants for virus. So like any of the plants that we would put in our auction in the fall, I just virus tested all the I virus tested the plant before I divided it, so I don't waste time making 6 divisions of plants that have virus. But it's a great question. It's something that is always top of mind for the hobbyist that's got more than just a handful of plants. And there are different types of tests. Agdia makes a test strip that's very accurate. There's also another, I forget the manufacturer off the top of my head, but that's made in Taiwan. It doesn't require refrigeration, a little bit more cost effective, but still, yeah, $5 to $7 a test is about right.
I think Riga Bio is the other one you mentioned.
Yep, that could be it. Yep. Okay,
Cool.
any other questions? Will anybody be brave enough to come to our meeting on Tuesday? You don't have to answer that, but again, just go to deepcutorchidsociety.org. We would welcome you as a guest. I'll be there. Francisco will be there, and we would love to have you.
Thank you, Bill. I will actually send that information out to the people who registered as well.
Okay, great.
So yeah, we'll send the website with the meeting. So this was great. I put in the chat, I'm like, I've never smelt an orchid. I was trying to remember. I don't think I've ever smelled. So I've probably only seen big box ones, right? So
yeah, and the Phalaenopsis
cool.
type, yeah, they're not typically fragrant.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are. A lot of them are.
Yeah, that's very cool. So I'm looking forward to that. So
excellent. So maybe we'll see you Tuesday.
Well, this Tuesday, no, because I have to work on Tuesday nights. So
okay, so we will not see you this Tuesday.
But I will no. But I will definitely try and make it. I'm almost ready. I'm like this close to taking.
You're almost ready. You're almost ready. The rest
Maybe I'll
of you,
watch this.
Yeah, Dara, Beth, Allison, Suzanne, we're ready for you. Anytime you want to come down, we'd love to have you.
So thank you very much. Thank you all for taking the time to attend. Bill, thank you again. This was really informative. You have a lot of knowledge and a lot of enthusiasm, and that's really contagious. So we very much appreciate it. And we hope that we can have you back again, perhaps on a different topic.
Would be happy to. Would be happy to.
Fantastic.
Okay, thank you, Liz.
Thank you all. I'm going to end the session, and I will hopefully see y'all soon. Take care.
Bye.